What up? What up? What up? It's your man Sean P coming in live. This is the Sean P Experience, man. Look, I got a very, very special Father's Day edition we have today, man. Professor, scholar, hip hop historian, amongst other things. Professor Mark Anthony Neal. How you doing today, my brother?
I'm good, Sean, man. Glad to be here with you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, man. It's always a blessing to have you here. Your podcast. I was telling my mom before I came on the air, the left of black. The left of black means so much to me for so many years. And before I came on, I saw the left of black and following you. I was like, I gotta get a screenshot. I like, Mama, look at this, the left of black. And she was like, okay. But it means so much to me as a podcast host and watching what you do for so many years, man.
Thank you, thank you. It's been a privilege to do Left of Black for so long.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Your official introduction. So, welcome to Cinema Degree Out Podcast. Today we have Professor Mark Anthony Neal, one of the nation's foremost scholars on black culture, black masculinity, hip hop, and the black experience. Professor Neal served as the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor and Chair of African and African American Studies at Duke University, where he teaches courses on black masculinity, popular culture, hip hop culture, along with the Grammy Award winning producer, The Ninth Wonder. Today, however, we are stepping beyond the scholarship and it's something deeply personal. His new book, Save a Seat for Me, Notes on American Fatherhood, explores fatherhood, family, vulnerability, mental health, and what it means to grow into the man you are still becoming. Professor Neal.
Man, thanks for having me back, Sean.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Nah, man, thanks for saying yes. So I want to ask you, every book has an origin story, a
Yeah,
spark
yeah.
that say, you know what? I got to go this direction. What was the spark for Save a Seat for Me?
I want to say that I've been writing this book for 20 years. When I first became a father, I wanted to write about my daughter, right? And then there was a second daughter. So I've always wanted to write this book. I'm glad I didn't write it back then because that version of the book would have been too aspirational. It would have been too romantic in the sense that I would have tried to put the prettiest bows on what fatherhood was. What I needed was to actually experience the struggles and the challenges of fatherhood, including the successes, and what it looks like when you're no longer parenting your kids, when they're adults. And so taking that long journey, my oldest daughter is 26, 27. My youngest daughter is 23. I'm now a grandfather of three grandsons. The ability to look back and see where I made mistakes, where I could have done better, where to give myself credit for the successes I actually had, and to get to the point where, as a 60-year-old man, I can go back and begin to do the work of taking care of myself after feeling the responsibility of taking care of so many, my wife and my children up to that point in time. So I'm glad, that I didn't write the book when I wanted to, right? Because now I get to be honest and vulnerable and free. One of the things I say about this book, I've written about Black masculinity before. This is a book that's not an analysis of Black fatherhood. This is a book that bears witness to Black fatherhood, to me as a father, to my father, and what I was as his son, and for the generation of Black men, including folks who are of my generation, who very rarely get the attention that they deserve for the challenges and the struggles and the work that they do to be engaged fathers.
So you mentioned being a grandfather now. Would you say your experience in how the actual stereotype is the grandparents treat the grandkids better than the kid, right? And you just said you see the mistakes you made, like, you know what, with the grandbabies, I can troubleshoot that thing now. I didn't know which, I was experimenting with y'all, but now I know. Is it kind of sort of like that?
The biggest thing is that when I'm with my grandsons now, two of them in Chicago, one is here in Durham with us. I'm so attentive to them. One is 3, one is 1, another one is 4 months old. I'm attentive to them now as a grandfather in ways that I couldn't be attentive to my daughters, because when I was with my daughters, I was always thinking about the other stuff, right? I need to get back to work, right? I need to do this, right? I need to do all this other stuff to make sure that their lives are as good as they can be. And so I didn't do enough of staying in the moment with them. And what I've learned as a grandfather is how to be in the moment with my grandson.
I love that answer, man. I'm not a grandfather just yet. Please, kids, hold off on that. But it gives me a lot of insight to anticipate whenever that time comes, right? Um, so most times I love to ask research questions about the book. But in this
Yeah.
book, I want to ask you a different kind of question.
Okay.
This is a very different book than your normally highly scholarly books that you
Yeah.
normally write. So the
Yeah.
question is, as far as the craft, what did this book demand out of you that your other books didn't?
Yeah. So, I was fortunate to work. My editor was Yadon Israel, a brother who was at Simon and Schuster. Yadon's 35, 36 years old, a young father himself. And we went back and forth, right? He's like, we know the work that you can do in terms of the analytics of it. This book has to lead, A, with storytelling, and it has to lead with your emotions, right? Folks need to see Mark Anthony Neal, not Mark Anthony Neal, the scholar, right? But Mark Anthony Neal, the man, Mark Anthony Neal, the father. And for me, it meant I had to change up my writing, right? I think it was very easy, and I think a lot of my peers would agree with this, when we can't quite find the emotions that we put on page, we find jargon to do that work, right? We find theoretical frameworks to do that work, right? Particularly as academics, because we're not expected to lead with our emotions. So I had to learn how to lead with my emotions. There's spaces where I do the analytical work, as you know, right? Talking about Bill Cosby, talking about, Malcolm X, talking about Nat King Cole. So there are moments where I do that, right? Because it's important to provide a historical and cultural context for what I'm writing about. But I needed to lead with the storytelling and, to lead with the emotions. And quite frankly, I don't imagine at this stage in my career that I will go back to the more traditional academic writing. Writing this book freed something up in me, right? And it's not just the storytelling and the emotions, but also what I do with language, right? I use language very differently, right? The language is frank and direct, and when I need to use profanity to make points, I do that, right? In
Yes,
ways
you
that would have
did.
been unaccepted as an academic.
Yes,
And
you
I think
did.
that's important, right? Because one of the things that Yadon said to me is that he said two things. He's like, and this is when my grandson had just been born, my first grandson. And he said, you need to write a book to make sure that when your grandson is 16 to 17 years old, he can read this book and find value in it, right? The second thing he reminded me of, when I was a kid, I had an alter ego. I grew up in the projects in the Bronx, a place called Neck. And there's this character on Happy Days, rare black character on the Happy Days called Booker Brown. And the cats I grew up with always said I looked like Booker Brown when I was a kid. So that became my nickname. Right. I mean, there's still dudes now. We're 60 years old, and they know me as Booker, right, as opposed to Mark Anthony Neal. He said, go back to how Booker viewed the world when Booker was 12, 13 years old, right? When Booker had no idea what it was going to be an academic, and never read bell hooks, didn't know who Michael Eric Dyson was, had never been in a college classroom before. Narrate the world about fatherhood and relationships from that perspective. And that was stuff that really grounded me in the ways that my parents shaped me, my community shaped me. I got back to think about my own aspirations as a 13 and 14-year-old in ways that I hadn't connected with before. One of the most revealing things about this book for me, because I'm writing about my father, right? And there was a lot of stuff that I unpacked about my father that I hadn't thought about. But it also revealed to me my mother in ways that I'd never thought about her before. So for me, all of that just kind of opened up like a waterfall of information and emotions that I was privileged to put down on paper.
I want you to speak about writing from the heart because when I have scholars on the show, I love to ask about. A lot of times, the academics it seem like you said, they want you to cut the heart off and just totally from the mind, totally analytical, and all this be away. And we have actual scholars that's in college right now watching the show, so it's like
Yeah.
talk about the importance of still finding a way to lead with the heart, lead with the emotion, still be yourself, even in this setting.
One of the reasons why this was so important in writing this book, because I parented as an intellectual, right? The way I thought about interacting with my daughters and being a good parent, it was through the guise of the intellectual, right? This idea that you think that you can just always reason with your children, that all of this should make some sort of logical sense. And it wasn't until really my youngest daughter really pulled me in to say, in the way that she could, I need more from you than that, right? I don't just need your parental guidance, right? I need for you to be fully emotionally aware and connected to me. And so that was so much about reminding myself of that in the book, right? I would turn in pages to Yardan, and Yardan would be, okay, this well and good, but you ain't telling me how you feel. And I'm going to tell you the combination of being an academic, but also being a black man, where we're not encouraged to talk about how we feel unless it's through anger, right? We're not encouraged to talk about vulnerability. We're not encouraged to talk about our fears, right? Because that's always seen in the larger context, particularly as black men, as some sort of weakness. So I had to work through all of that, right, to be able to put down these moments, right? There are moments in the book where I talk about being in situations with my daughters and lamenting 20 years later that I didn't stand up the way that I needed to stand up at that time, right? And for me, that was an admission of a weakness, that I didn't engage at the time, but I had to come to terms with acknowledging that now, now that I'm on the other side of the process.
One last conversation about the craft, about the language, right? You mentioned about the language, and sometimes you're talking very, very candidly, giving your real emotions in these situations. I think in this, I want to say this. You were definitely using your language, your cursing or whatever. And we were always taught back in the days, like if you use profanity, it's because you have a lack of vocabulary. You have a lack of words. And you a word man, so you definitely can say what you want. But sometimes the only word that fit right here is this. So speak to the use of profanity sometimes. Speak on how that's still important in the language.
I remember a lesson that I learned very, very early in my career. I was teaching at an HBCU in New Orleans. I won't say which one, but it's pretty well known for producing medical doctors. Um, and the dean at the time had pulled me aside because in the classroom, vernacular language is important to me, right? And I don't think about profanity as profanity as such, but vernacular language, right? That's what it's. All of our concerns about profanity is really framed from a class perspective. That if you aspire to be a certain kind of cultural or social class, you don't use certain kinds of language. And I always wanted to dispense of that in the classroom, right? Because I always wanted my students to be comfortable talking to me and talking to their classmates in the language that they were most comfortable with, right? And some folks don't have access to quote unquote higher language, right? Which is what I was when I was younger. And so one of the ways I wanted to make students, always wanted my students to feel more comfortable around language was for me to use vernacular freely in the classroom to free them up. So I remember a dean pulling me aside and, Dr. Neal, I hear that you cuss in class, right? And I remember my response, I pulled in some Habermas, I pulled in some Baudrillard, I pulled in all these European theorists, who talk about language. And I remember my dean, who was a chemist, going, Professor Neal, I don't frankly know what you're talking about. And I go, that's my point. sometimes the theory doesn't allow you to reach folks the way that you do, and you lean in on the vernacular for it to make sense to them, right? And once the ideas make sense in vernacular language, then you can introduce them to the theoretical.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. I want to drill down a little bit right here on the brother Yudan Israel. I've been knowing him for a couple of years myself. I'm a part of his advanced reader book club for a couple of years, so that's how I got this book early. I'm a part of
Okay.
his situation with that incredible brother. But my question for you is: you're a long-time scholar. You've written many books before, and you've interviewed so many scholars. Tell us about the difference that he made in this book versus what you did previous before him.
Woo. So, my agent, who's Tanya McKinnon, um, who represents a lot of Black writers and scholars, um, I've been honored, for her to have repped me now for almost 15 years. Was introduced to her, via Michael Dyson. And, she was having a conversation with Yondan. Yondan said, I want a fatherhood book. Yondan at the time was a new father. She goes, I got just the person, right? So she makes this introduction sometime in 2023. Um, I had always thought that I worked with some really wonderful uh, academic editors. And I'm thinking particularly of Eric Zinner, who was my editor at NYU Press, and we did two great books, Black Ephemeral and Looking for Leroy. Um, and I always found him to be an incredibly attentive editor. This is my first trade book. It's a different kind of relationship you have with your editor. And I didn't grasp that until about a year into the process. And Yadan would call me Saturday afternoons, Sunday mornings, just to chop it up. Um, and that was a game changer for me, right? I had never worked with an editor who was so attentive, right? And part of what he explained to me is like, this is what it means to work with a trade press, right? But it was also a story that he was invested in as a Black father. He wanted the book to succeed, right? He wanted me to be successful. And he prodded me, right? One of the things about being done with the book, I'm actually going to miss when we were working on the book, our communications, right? Because we would talk talk on the phone twice a week, text almost every day. It was great having a thinking partner, right, in this project in ways that I had not had a thinking partner.
I got a good analogy for you, a good hip hop analogy. It remind me of whenever Nas got with hit. Nas is always Nas for his words. But people always say, man, if you had the right production, if you had the right sound to go with the words, and it's like, you and Udon seem like this,
Yeah,
this, 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 this your king disease. King disease.
it's early in Nas's career, right? All the stuff that he did with Primo, right? It just hit a little differently than some of the other ones. At some point early in the project, I referred to Yadan as Nelson Riddle. Nelson Riddle was a producer and arranger for Frank Sinatra. Some of Frank Sinatra's best work from the mid 50s into the 1960s was stuff that he arranged with Nelson Riddle. When Yadan was pushing me and challenging me differently, I often refer to as Norman Whitfield. Um, Norman Whitfield, who was a producer and arranger with Motown, famously, when he worked with Marvin Gaye on I Heard It Through the Grapevine, he had pushed Marvin to sing in a certain kind of register that Marvin Gaye didn't like. And Marvin talked about the fact that I wanted to fight him, right? I wanted to go into the control room and fight Norman Whitfield. And I realized I needed both, right? I needed the Nelson Riddle, who was going to help me craft my sound in the best way. But I also needed the Norman Whitfield, who knew what buttons to push to make me angry enough and frustrated enough to go back to the lab, right, and do better work.
I want to go to the beginning of the book, the heart and soul of it that really caught me. You go back to Mother's Day, 2008, and there was
Mm,
this incredible, this breakdown, if you will, that happened. For
mhm.
the sake of Black men watching the show, when it comes to our health and how we manage things, Speak about what happened on that day when you were driving and what took place.
We were driving to New York, and I was still young enough where I could hop in a car and drive 8 hours. Um, it was different then, right? Because I got a wife and two daughters in the car, so I have all these kinds of concerns. My father had just passed away 3 months earlier, 4 months earlier. My mother was dealing with some things. That's part of the reason why we were going to New York at the time. Um, and all I remember is I'm going north on I-95. Right? And those of you who've ever done that drive, you know, any part from Richmond all the way up to the Jersey Turnpike, sometimes it's 4 or 5 lanes across. I mean, it's treacherous doing driving. And I'm in the far passing lane, right? And I just lose it, right? I was literally feeling as though I was trapped, right? And all I knew is I had to get to the other side and pull over because I was losing grasp of what was happening. And that had never happened to me before, right? And I remember, describing the story to um, my best friend, Frank Paul Jr., and, he goes, it sounds like you had like a nervous breakdown. And that was a moment for me because I had to begin personally to unpack what I was dealing with. Part of it was my feeling of guilt for not being able to be a better son to my parents who were up in New York and assisting them, fear of not being around long enough to parent my daughters, fear of not being around long enough uh, to grow old with my wife, fear of never reaching the potential that I thought I had as a writer, as a scholar. I mean, it's all this kind of stuff, right? I'm in the moment of my career where I'm still very much on the grind. Where I'm trying to build a career, build a reputation, build something for my family. And it was this moment where it finally came down on me, in ways that I had to figure out how to manage it. The irony of the story, though, is that I don't begin therapy for another 6 years because in my mind, right, therapy, what's that? Right. That's not, I was 43 years old at the time. At that time, I'm never thinking that I need to go to therapy. And it was only when my youngest daughter began therapy, right, when she was 10, 11 years old. And I realized to be a better partner to her, in her journey through therapy, that I needed to go to therapy myself. And it was a game changer for me.
I think that was an incredible opening for me because, again, reading your previous books and your other kind of work, when you open up with this, I don't think the average person watching you on Left the Black or whatever, we're not thinking about what you're internalizing and what's happening in your personal life and what you're juggling. We have no idea of that. And for a lot of us
Yeah,
black men, we're showing up every day smiling, we're looking like,
absolutely.
and we just
Absolutely
holding it.
right.
We just holding it. We just holding it.
I mean, because as black men, there's a kind of stoicism that we're trained. Right? We're always trained to keep it together, right? To never show our emotions, right? Anger or anything else, just hold it all together. And this was always going to be part of the book. But this is again where Yadana and I having the conversation. He's like, you need to open with a Tony Soprano moment. And when we watch The Sopranos, right, the opening moment of The Sopranos is Tony Soprano in therapy, and everybody's like, "What? Right? How could the mafia gangster be in therapy?" Right? And again, it was a wise decision because it was a signal to people, as you mentioned, that this is something else, right? This is not some one sanitized, therapeutic, anesthetically uh, example of talking about fatherhood, right? This is about what It is experiencing it, living through it, being challenged by it. Um, one of the metaphors that I talk about in the book in relationship to my father and I, he was an incredible baseball fan, right? So he made me a baseball fan. I like to joke that I'm like the last handful of Negroes alive, who are baseball fans because of that. And one of the things he taught me early on about the game is, right, the most successful hitters, folks who have 300 averages and go on to have 3,000 hits and all, they fail 7 out of 10 times, right? Failure is a feature of fatherhood, right? No one gets beyond that, right? You're always going to make mistakes. That's what fatherhood, that's what parenting is, making mistakes.
And you speak on your daughter, and she had an internal journey of feeling inadequate body image, skin tone, and being adopted, things like that. So, what was it like watching her deal with it and manage these things? How was it a mirror to yourself? How you started your journey, watching her journey?
Part of it, I think, I'm 60 years old in the context of my career as an academic. I'm a made man, right? To go back to the Sopranos example again, what does it mean to be me and still feel some imposter syndrome, right? And that's part of what she was dealing with, right, as a child. Um, and when I realized that it wasn't something that I can intellectualize with her, that's not what she needed. Um, it became a challenge for me to figure out, you know, not only to be a better parent for her, and in this weird kind of way, part of what this book is about is me thinking about how I would parent myself, right? Thinking about who I was as a 7, 8, 10, 12 year old, right? And what I needed, right? That I couldn't articulate to my parents at the time, right? No different in the ways that my daughters couldn't articulate that to me. Um, so that's when it became kind of really important, right? And part of what she was demanding from me, I, you know, I, I'd like to think that I was a present parent, right? Certainly more present than my father was allowed to be because he worked all the time. But being present is not the same thing as being engaged, and it's not the same as making yourself emotionally available to your children, right? And that's the lesson that I learned for her, right, from her, how to make myself emotionally vulnerable to her and available to her, right? That goes beyond just being there and on some level being attentive.
I know in the military we got a phrase we call being a battle buddy. In boot camp, you have a battle buddy. You're accountable together, you motivate and inspire each other or whatever. How was your daughter kind of a battle buddy for you in your process, your therapy, your healing? How was that your battle buddy?
Yeah, I write about this. I mean, for whatever reason, it's almost like she's an empath. Um, but she seemed to be finely in tune with my emotional state, in ways that I wasn't necessarily aware of. Uh, and it's still this way now. I mean, I write about this in the book. She has this way where, if I'm working at the computer, she'll come up to me and scratch the top of my head, as almost as if a way to remind me to stay in the world and not get caught up in the work. And it was a challenge, right? I mean, you know this, right? Raising children is a challenge, right? And the children are all different, and they demand different things, and you can't cookie cutter parent them, right? You have to have a very specific parenting plan for each one of them, right? And often that's going to be at odds, right? And I had two daughters, and daughters, vie for the attention of their fathers, in ways that I don't think boys function the same way. I mean, they're vying for attention very often from their mothers in that way. Um, so it really was a challenge for me, particularly as she got older and more articulate about her wants and needs, and we didn't always disagree, right? That was where the biggest challenge was. When she was 7 or 8 years old, I could always fix it. When she was 15 to 16 years old, that's different. I mean, I talk about in the book the fact that, the most important thing about parenting that I've learned, again, something that I could not have written about 20 years ago. But what do you do when your children become old enough to hold you in judgment, right? You can get away from stuff with stuff when they're 5 or 6 years old because they're gonna believe anything you say, right? And they're always gonna believe the best in you. There's a point where they get 15, 16 years old and they start calling you on your BS, right? And articulate that very clearly, right? And for a lot of parents, it's like, oh, right. But I had to work. That's the stuff that I had to work
Yeah. Yeah, my friends that have younger kids and they always fuss and complain about buying the diapers or the daycare costs or the little league baseball, whatever. I'm like, bro, when your children
with.
are adults, is a way different kind of parents. I don't think it's talked about enough openly when you're parenting adults. And they
Right.
got their own mind, they got their own everything. And
And
they're
there's
really
still parents try.
they're almost when they're critiquing you in your parenting. How
Yes.
do you deal with, you work hard as you could, you did whatever you could to provide, send them to the best schools, you did what you did on your mind, and they feel like you didn't do this, this, and this.
Right.
And
They
why?
remember every little slight.
Exactly.
Right.
Every
It's like,
little
yeah.
thing. Yeah. When I was 5 years old on a Thursday, you said this. You like, what? I was eating Burger King watching the game. Like, I don't remember that. So the real question is help us understand, how do you deal with those conversations? Whenever they come into you like, Daddy, I'm looking at this. You could have did this better. You could have did this right. How do you swallow that and then give them what they need in the moment?
You have to accept the critique honestly. I mean, what our children are often telling us in that moment is that you haven't listened to me enough. Right. And you know, it's easy not to listen to them when they were younger because you can always find other ways to redirect their attention. Here's this piece of candy, right? You want to watch another half an hour of TV, right? There's always ways we can divert those tensions when they're younger. When they become adults and have their own minds, right? You have to sit with the critique and not be defensive about what they're telling you. Um, when I think about, as a young man, even before I had kids, I had strident critiques of my parents. Now, I was of a generation where I would never tell them what I thought about their parenting, right? That was a clear line, right? However I felt about how my parents parented me, I was never going to tell them that. But I had to think to myself as I'm listening to the critiques from my daughters, I was like, well, I had those same critiques of my parents, right? This is a perfectly natural progression of what it means to parent, right? And so you have to learn how to deal with the new relationship that you have with your adult kids, right? You parent as they need you, right? You in the way that when they're younger, you're you're parenting all the time. You're trying to protect them from things, right? All of those kinds of things. You have to parent with a lighter hand when they get older, right? And let's be clear, you continue to parent. There are always going to be moments when they're going to need you, right? And they're not necessarily going to ask you for it because they are adults, right? So you always have to be attentive to those kinds of things and be self-aware of where they are in their lives. But you just parent with a much, much lighter hand than you would normally.
My scholar friend in the comments asked the question, Dr. Neal, how do you navigate the thought of what are my kids saying about me when they're grown? How do you navigate those thoughts, Dr. Neal?
You don't. This is the thing, particularly as we're talking about Black fathers. being a black father is part of our identity. It's not a whole identity. When you're deep into parenting, that identity takes over all of your other identities, right? If you're a good, engaged father, parent, you know, you're engulfed with the ideas and questions around parenting. When your adult children begin to really think about who you are, you have to understand that that's only one part of your identity, right? And again, what's built into it is that you know that you failed. As fathers, we already know when we fail our children, right? What bothers us when we're adults is that they can call us on it, right? That that's the difference, right? And so you have to have a level of self-awareness about who you are broadly in the world and how parenting, being a father, is just one part of that identity, right? And then you can withstand and critique that way because it's about who you were at a given time and where you might have dropped the ball, right? To be able now to be at a stage, even if it's not necessarily productive to your relationship with your children, you can recognize where you make mistakes, right? And understand that, right? That's part of what your children are telling you, right? Because you can't go back to what you didn't do when they were 15 years old. You can't do that, right? But they need you to hear from them. This is where you make a mistake. And you just take that. You take that, you accept it, thank them for the insight, right? And hope that you can build and sustain better relationships with them as they are adults.
Yeah, man, totally, absolutely. So we have Father's Day coming up on this weekend. Happy Father's Day to the fathers out there early, grandfathers, everybody. So my question is, give us kind of an idea of Mark Anthony Neal before fatherhood, and how did fatherhood change whenever those daughters came into your life? What was that, man, the drastic difference, if there was a difference?
Before I had children, and again, I'm still on the come up as an academic. So I worked all the time. My wife and I, we didn't take vacations, right? Because I was working all the time. And I think she accepted that because she understood who I was, right? And my ambition. So she gave me space to do that. When my oldest daughter came along, I had to rethink that. One of the things I learned real early is that you cannot fit children around your schedule, right? You have to fit your life around their schedule, right? And I mean that is that you can't control when they get sick and you got to be home with them. You can't control when they don't want to go down for a nap or they don't want to go to bed. You have to be there and present for that. So you had to figure out how to work around that. I actually became a much more productive scholar, especially with my oldest daughter, because I would drop her off at daycare. I would go to SUNY Albany, where I was teaching at the time, teach my classes, and I'd have a window of 3 or 4 hours before I had to pick her up. I knew I had to be productive in those 3 or 4 hours because once I picked her up, it was over. I think the fact that I was the father of Black girls also changed the way that I saw the world from a gendered standpoint. I never wanted them to have to deal with the kind of BS that they were going to deal with as girls and women, and in particular from Black girls, as Black girls and Black women. So, I had to be a more accountable around my own gender sensibilities and expectations. Um, very early in my career, I identified myself as a Black male feminist. And a lot of that was a theoretical and intellectual engagement. Raising two Black girls made it real to me in ways that I had to engage, right, and be much more thoughtful about and thinking about that world. I talk about that in terms of, my quandary about how to discipline my Black daughters. I'm of a generation, my parents, my mother in particular, who was the primary disciplinarian when I was growing up, you know, if they didn't spare the rod, for lack of a better way to say it, right? If something needed to be handled that way, it was handled, right? They sent me to a 7-day Adventist school, my parents, grades 1 through 8. And, they still put a ruler on kids. If you act out in class, they roll you up into the front of the class, you get 3 lashes in the
Remember the
back,
rulers? Remember
with
that?
18-inch ruler, right? So for me, that was normal, right? They were guardrails, right? I understood that, right? I never, even now, I never saw it as abuse. I saw it as standing, setting up some guardrails about behavior, right? And if you cross the line, there would be a penalty for that, right? For me, that was a normative way of parenting. I felt differently about that when I became a father. One, because intellectually, I thought I could just reason with my children. There's no reasoning with a 3-year-old. It doesn't work that way, right? I understand it even more so, looking at my grandsons and watching from afar as my daughters try, my oldest daughter at least, tries to navigate the 3-year-old and the 1-year-old, right, who you can't reason with. But also, I didn't want to take this level. I didn't want to engage violence in dealing with my daughter. Right. For me, that seemed as though I needed to find another way. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues. Um, we're having a debate. A bunch of us were out for dinner at an academic conference, and we're talking about parenting. Right. Two of us were parents, one wasn't. And the one who wasn't was like, I can't imagine ever beating my kids. Right. And I remember the other brother was like, look, they have to know that it's always a possibility. Right? Even if you don't do it, right? They need to know that there's a possibility around this, right? And there was a part of me that when my daughters were younger, I would make the argument, that if I tapped them on the back of the head, right, that was about gender equity because I wouldn't have a second thought that if I had two sons, of popping them on the back of the head, right? I mean, that's how kind of insane the process is. But having daughters made me think about, differently about parental violence, right? The lines that can be crossed, the mistakes that can be made. And I had to think about violence in different ways, not just in terms of the quote unquote physical violence, but the tone of your voice, the volume of your voice. I mean, all of that is forms of violence, right? You just can't go through the world yelling at your kids, right? You have to find other ways and find a broader toolkit to figure out how to parent. I'm sure that because I had daughters, I was much more thoughtful about that than I would have been if I just had sons.
Yes, sir. You mentioned doing the work before your dog. You mentioned the work. And one of your early chapters in the book, it's a dichotomy for most of us guys when it comes to today's society. Everything's so expensive, inflation and everything. So it's like you feel like it's either or. You feel like either I'm going to get it, which means I'm going to be gone. I want to be absentee. I'm on the road. I'm trying to get it. I'm trying to make it. Or
Yeah.
I can be super present when we ain't got it. So it's like, how do you as a man deal with the two-ness, right? Like the boy said, the two-ness. How you deal with the two-ness of I'm going to get it or I ain't got it? And both of those are not good for the guy.
Right.
It's like a double evil.
One of the more insidious stereotypes about black men is that black men are lazy. If you look at the history in this country, at least, of black men, so much of the black male identity is tied to work. Even the cats who out there in the corners hustling, to them, that is in fact work, right? It's the job that they can get at that moment. And I think as black men, we convince ourselves that that part of our identity is more important than anything, right? Our ideas about fatherhood are connected to how we provide for our families. We can't provide for our families if we don't work. I'm fortunate. I'm privileged in the kind of work that I do, right? Don't mean I ain't on the grind. But my dad's generation where work meant 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that's not even talking about the commute back and forth to work. You just can't be around. Right. And, that was something that when I was a child, I could not appreciate that. My father worked 6 days a week. He never went to a parent teacher conference. That was always my mother. If I was doing some sort of gospel choir performance or playing Little League Baseball or something like that, he was never around for those things. I held him an account for that for a long time as the ways in which I thought that he had failed me. But then I became a father. And I realized that there were choices now that, I can't do this because I need to travel here because I need to make this money, right? They need clothes, they need shoes, they need food. Oh my God, summer camp is coming, right? And that's a whole different kind of course, right? Because either they're going to be home with you all the time and I'm not going to get any work done, right? Or we got to figure out how to pay for summer camp. Or, and brothers get caught up in that loop, right? It keeps us away from our kids. It keeps us emotionally unavailable to our kids. I mean, when I think about my father, when he comes home from work after riding the subway, when we're in the Bronx, he's working in Brooklyn, he doesn't have the energy, right, to be there and be engaged with me. He's not trying to deal with this little 78-year-old who got 50 million questions. He just wants to hit his Johnny Walker, right, smoke a couple of cigarettes and go to bed because he got to start that joint up the next day, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. Black men work themselves to death, right? And because we're so attuned that we don't want to be failing fathers. I mean, one of the arguments I make in the book is that there's much more shame if you're a black man to being a bad father and a non-present father than it is to being a bad husband or a bad partner. Right? People write books about fatherless black children. They don't necessarily write books about, you know, black fathers who can't be good husbands. All right. There's shame to that, but it's not the same kind of shame. And work is the way that we show up. Even black men, as some of the data has shown, when you do comparisons of black men who are not in the home with their children versus their white male peers, right? Black men tend to be much more engaged with their children than their white male peers are, right? Same economic status, et cetera, in part because of the shame that's associated with not being present as a father, right? And say the brothers who were incarcerated, right, and other kinds of dynamics, right, issues that they're having with the mother of their children. I'm hard pressed to find black men who are not always trying to find ways to stay connected with their kids, right? Work is one of the challenges of being able to do that effectively.
You have a wonderful chapter in the book, man. You're talking about Malcolm X. I love Malcolm X. I'm an incredible Malcolm X fanatic, right? But what I want to talk about is the many versions of a black man. So
Mhm.
you, Mark Anthony Neal, like the way we all see Mark Anthony Neal versus who you are at the house in private,
Yeah,
in the evening. Uh, Speak about once again the two-ness of that because the way Malcolm was to you versus to his daughters was starkly different,
different.
and they were competing manhoods, if you will.
Yeah, I go back to his daughter's memoir about being Malcolm X's daughter, and she talks about these moments she spent with him when she was a child, when he would come into the kitchen and ask her to put her finger in his coffee cup because he needed a little sweetness. And all the ways that we think about Malcolm X, right, who had six daughters, we rarely think about Malcolm X as a girl dad, right? That's not part of the identity, right? And I'm younger when I'm reading this about Malcolm, and in the early stages of being a father myself, and it was such an image of Malcolm that went against what I thought about who Malcolm was or who he should be. And it did make me think about the ways that there's a way in which my daughters, particularly my older daughter, would mimic the kind of seriousness that I was out in the world with. Um, she saw that as who she thought I was privately. My youngest daughter kind of poked holes in it, right? She knew how. I mean, it's literally like she was poking me in my sides all the time to get a laugh out of me, right? To say that, we know that you're not this person that you are to the world all the time, right? You're our dad. You're silly. You're laugh. You're vulnerable. I tell the story in the book about, you know, my oldest daughter when Obama, gets the nomination and I'm kind of a little teary, right? So she had seen that part of me, right? So, it was easier for her to see me in my fullness. I mean, part of what this comes down to, how do we allow our children to see the fullness of who we are, right? Not always as just simply their parent who's always in the parental mode, right? Not always as the professional who's working in the world, right? How do we allow them into the very different kinds of experiences of who we are? I take with pride that I think my daughters believed that I was silly, you know, when I was raising them, right? That was a part of my identity that I wanted them to know, beyond the seriousness. I always wanted them to know that they could talk to me about anything, right? That part of our relationship, and it's very different than a relationship with their mother, with my wife, right? But if there's stuff that you felt the need to say, as long as it's respectful, I'm comfortable with you telling me how you need to be. One of the things I always said about my daughters, I wanted to make sure that when they were adults and out in the world, that they never felt the need to mute or censor themselves, right? That they would always feel comfortable speaking truth to power in the way that they needed to speak truth to power to the world. And that had to start in their relationship with me, what they could say to me. Right? The thing that always tripped them up was the line, right? That I don't think they ever understood that I would get more upset about you lying about something than you just owning up to the fact that you did something. Right. And this is a world in which we don't encourage kids to think that way. Right. Right. We encourage kids to, always toe the line, do the right things. Right. There's always a line that you're going to cross. My youngest daughter, as I describe her in the book, right, she's a habitual line stepper. At least she was as a child. If there was a line to cross, she would cross it. Right. But we would have conversations about why it was important for her to cross that line. Right. And I think that was an important part of us building a relationship.
So I want to ask this question. Have your daughters or your family in large, have your family read the book yet? Because it's different writing about, like, your father isn't here anymore, rest in peace to your parents, right? But like people that still here and they can read the book or see the podcast or they can hear the words, they're like, wait a minute, daddy, that didn't go like that. Or I didn't think, like, how was that when you find when they finally saw the book? How was that?
So they didn't get copies of books
Okay.
until the advanced copies were available. And I remember Yadon asking me, "I haven't read the book yet." Right. And, very, very early in my career, my wife would read drafts of my books. That stopped about 15 years ago. Right. So she hadn't read it. My oldest daughter didn't have it yet. My youngest daughter read it in about a day. Right. She's a fast reader. She's a voracious reader. Um, I think she was comfortable with how she's talked about in the book. My oldest daughter is a little bit more critical and a little bit more cerebral. I'll be interested to see how, she processes it. I think the challenge with my wife around the book, and this is part of what I write about also in terms of thinking about not only who you are as a father, but how you are fathering as a husband or a partner, are the things that I might have been processing and going through that I didn't share with her. right? I was in therapy for a year before I told her I was in therapy, right? And for her, that was a bright line for her. It's like, maybe I could have helped you. It's like, no, I needed something else, right? I needed another voice who wasn't going to hold me in judgment, right? As I tried to work through some of these things that was going on, in my life.
Okay, before we get out of here, I got two additional questions outside of the book. The first one is about hip hop. So we saw
Yeah,
the big Jay Z performance a few weeks ago, the Roots picnic, and give me your thoughts on the past few years. The elder statesmen of hip hop are kind of like holding the flag for hip hop. The Clips and all the other guys that are over 40 years old, rapping at an incredible pace, incredible, Method Man, the Wu Tang Clan, Nas. They're on top of the food chain right now. So what's it like whenever hip hop is perceived as a young man's game, and the older guys pop out every once in a while and still show you like I can still drop 81 points whenever I want. You know what I'm saying? Like speak on that.
yeah. Nas has made, with the exception of Illmatic and Stillmatic and maybe another piece in there, has made the best albums of his career, right? In the last 3 or 4 years. Listening to the Clips, LL dropped an album a few years ago that was, some of the best work that he had done in years. It's a recognition, I think, that hip hop's audience has grown old with it. That the same way that we talk about adult contemporary, rock music, right? We can talk about adult hip hop. That's I'm thinking about the De La album that came out. I mean, it's these are cats who are in their 50s and 60s that still have stories to tell, that still have a skill set. It's no different. BB King was out there till he was 80 years old. Ray Charles was out there until his 70s. Patti LaBelle is still out there in her 80s. Gladys Knight, Dinah Ross. And there's still audiences who are thriving to hear them both live and then they're recording. So I'm happy to see that hip hop is not just having an adult life, but a middle age life, at this moment. And I'm not as compelled, obviously, to listen to what 19-year-olds are listening to. I drop my ear into it, just to see if there's something interested. But if I'm not listening to some of the old heads doing new music now, I'm listening to the old heads in their peak, because that's the music that speaks to me.
So we're never gonna do the shut up and dribble kind of thing. We're never gonna do that. But
Yeah.
like what are your thoughts on the recent news about Jay-Z and possibly partnering with Target after the whole Target boycott for DEI and everything? Like, what's your take on the hip hop artists and they're in community? They represent us, but like they made these choices. But you a rapper, like what do we expect from these entertainers? I mean,
Look, Jay Z might be my favorite rap artist as an artist. I think we have to hold him accountable as a businessman, as someone who is invested in making money, as a capitalist, right? And I'm not one of these folks who's gonna go in deep on the deep end with a critique of capitalism. People need money to live, right? And if you have a skill set that allows you to make money, you should be able to do that unfettered, right? But we also can't have a love affair of money and be addicted to money. Um, when we think about these rappers and other folks who enter these partnerships with these corporations that we've have a problematic relationship with, they represent us, but are they really still of community? Right. I think that's really important. One of the reasons why I've cherished my relationship for more than 20 years now with Knife Wonder, you know, he could be living anywhere, right? He's never left the triangle. in North Carolina and Winston-Salem, right? Living amongst people, right? It's important. We talk about working class and middle class and all this kind of stuff. We don't talk about middle class rappers. When we talk about rap artists, we are talking about the elite of the elite, right? Who have access to capital that most folks don't. The majority of rappers, you know, are working class, middle class guys, literally in the studio all the time and in tour all the time just to be able to live a quality life based on their talent. Most of them are never going to achieve the kind of financial stability of a Jay-Z or Snoop, right? And so we can't judge hip hop on the 1% of hip hop, right? We have to judge hip hop on the folks who do
One
it for the
percent.
love of
You're
the
right.
culture, who
One
do it for the
percent.
love of the culture. Yeah.
Okay, and in closing, man, we got to talk about this. The Knicks, the New York Knicks, your 2026 NBA champion after what 53 years, something like that. Um, Being the lifelong New York, the man you are. What was it like watching that clock go down to zero, the ball, the confetti drop, everybody celebrating? What was that like for you, experiencing that in your lifetime?
So let me tell you this. My wife and I were at game 4 where they
Oh
made the
wow!
comeback.
In the
We were
building,
in the guard, we're in the building
in the
for that.
building. Wow!
And, halftime, Trump had been there. The energy was kind of low. They were losing by 29
Oh,
points.
you was there for that game.
Yeah, yeah. And then Wu Tang comes out. Wu Tang sages the place. The energy changes. Watching them systematically come back, it was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. Just the energy of all those folks there, folks high fiving people across 3 rows, and then OG with the tip in. I had never experienced anything like that, right? It was amazing just to be there for a playoff game. I don't get to do a whole lot of Knicks games. I hadn't been until we went to see the Knicks at Madison Square Garden in December. I hadn't been to Madison Square Garden in 25 years. Since I took my oldest daughter to the circus. Hadn't been to a Knick game in more than 30 years at Madison Square Garden. We do see them when they come to Charlotte all the time. So to be in the Garden for what is now the biggest comeback in the history of the NBA Finals, there was nothing like that. So by the time they won it, the next game, it was like it was anticlimactic to me, right? Because I was never going to experience anything the way that I experienced that comeback with.
I'm trying to decide between Chicago fans and New York fans, like who are the worst? Like my Chicago guys, they love their Chicago teams. And my
You
New
know,
York people, my y'all love y'all teams so much. Like for the next 20 years, it's gonna be about
yeah,
last week.
and they're special in this regard because, like, the Yankees have won 26 championships, but there are at least 4 baseball fan bases in New York. The Yankees, and there's the Mets, and there's still cats around who are Brooklyn Dodger and New York Giant fans, right? So the loyalty around baseball is split. Hockey is hockey. Hockey's never going to get the whole city engaged the same way. The Giants won their Super Bowls playing in Jersey, right? They're not a New York team. They haven't played in New York since 1977, right? The Jets are the Jets, right? We ain't seen the championship since 1969. And, though the Nets have been to the finals, the Nets were never New York. They were Long Island. They were Piscataway, New Jersey. Now they're, the face of gentrification in downtown Brooklyn. The Knicks fan base is different, right? Because it's a ride or die. They're the only team in town around basketball. Basketball crosses across, ethnicities, right? You remember professional basketball was a Jewish sport in the 30s and the 40s, right? Jewish players dominated professional basketball then it became a black sport,
Yes,
right?
sir.
And New York now, it's a diasporic sport. When you think about where cats are, whether you're talking about OG or Carl Anthony coming from the Dominican Republic, Jason Brunson with his mother's from Jamaica, right, or Jamaican parents. I mean, it's a diasporic experience, right? So it speaks to what New York is now. And then the soundtrack of New York Knicks basketball is '90s Tim's brothers, right? There's a reason why Fat Joe and Wu Tang and Nas and Jay Z resonate, right? Because those fans who came up watching Mark Jackson in the late '80s, who fell in love with Anthony Mason, right? God rest him, and Charles Oakley and Patrick Ewing and that '94 team, right? Those are the folks who were raised on that moment. So for us, right, to be able to see this one, '99 was cool, but it was something about that '94 team, right, that should have won the chip. John Starks, right, who was bagging groceries, right, before he came into that's a New York Knicks team, and that's the folks that you saw really giving a lot of support to the
Do me, do me a favor, Professor. For the folks that are not like avid sports fans, for a lot of my ladies in particular, I'm trying to explain to them the fandom that they were seeing, leading up to the series and everything. Like how galvanizing is sports, even in some small rural town somewhere where there's a lot of racism. On Friday night, when it's time for the football game, the whole town stops.
everybody's there.
And
Yeah,
we all on one accord for 2 hours. We on the same page.
you couldn't. Yeah, you know,
So,
I
talk about that.
I had gone to New York the week before, actually to go up to Simon and Schuster and hang out with Yadon for a little bit, and I went into the NBA store. Right, never been there before, and there are young kids there, 11, 12 years old. They're 80-year-old dudes who look like the ghost of Red Holtzman, right? Who coached the '69 and '73. I had never seen anything like that before. And they were all looking for Knicks gear. Every place you walked in the city, caps, jerseys, folks who were still masked up had New York Knicks mask. There was nothing like that I had ever seen before, right? And there's something about sports that taps into a greater good, right? Particularly beyond the commercialism of it, right? Because I think with every person, you attach yourself to an artist, to an athlete or a team, and you see a little bit of yourself. The Knicks are so New York. The striving, the falling short, the failing, but then the winning in such a spectacular mode. It is just so New York, right? And to listen to folks going around the city going, my mayor is Muslim and my bagels are Jewish, just as a reminder of what New York City is and the diversity of the place. It's an amazing moment for New York, right? I wish every place in America can experience the best of what that experience has been for New Yorkers. And those of us like myself who haven't lived in New York for 30 years, right? But I'm still a New Yorker, right? I still claim New York. I still claim the South Bronx where I was born and raised. Once you're a New Yorker, you're always a New Yorker.
Thank you very, very much for this podcast episode, Professor, man. Thank you so much. Anybody watching this, go out there and pre-order right now. Pre-order. My brother support, get his numbers up, get his notoriety up.
August
He
4th, August 4th.
August the 4th, man. August the 4th. Save a seat for me. Notes on American Fatherhood. Any black man, please, please read this book. Any lady out there, get it for the guy in your life, man. Until next time, see y'all next time on the Sean P. Experience See with the Griots podcast.
Thank
Bless.
you, Sean.
Thank you, sir. And we are off the